My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said her entire family would be spending Christmas here at my house, all 30 of them. I just smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and told her that was absolutely perfect. I let her know I was heading to Park City for the holidays, and she was welcome to cook and clean for the whole lot of them herself, because I am nobody's servant. Every drop of color left her face. She went white as a sheet. But what was coming next, the thing that would leave both her and my son utterly penniless and without a roof over their heads, she never saw it coming. My name is Gerald, 71 years old, 40 years spent as a structural engineer, bridges, commercial high-rises, parking garages. I've built them all. I understand how to measure load, how to read stress before it breaks something, and how to spot a foundation rotting from the inside out. Evelyn and I raised our dream home together in a quiet, well-heeled pocket of Indianapolis, Indiana. 4 bedrooms, brick colonial, on a double lot. The kind of yard where old oak trees have been standing longer than most of the neighbors have been alive. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. Before we get into today's story, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment and tell me what the weather looks like where you are right now. Stories like this one always hit a little differently when a cold wind is rattling the windows. Please note that some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. It was our sanctuary. Evelyn passed away 7 years ago, taking a massive piece of my heart with her, but leaving me with a house full of beautiful memories. I kept the property in immaculate condition, quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. That held true until 3 years ago, when my son Nolan and his wife Serena showed up at my door with a sad story and a moving truck. Nolan is 34 years old. He is my only child, and it pains me to admit that somewhere along the way, I failed to put any spine in him. He married Serena 5 years ago. Serena is 32, consumed by social media image and hell-bent on living a lifestyle she has no business affording. 3 years ago, Nolan claimed their landlord was hiking the rent to an unreasonable level. They asked if they could take over my spare bedrooms for just 6 months. 6 short months they swore, just long enough to stack up a solid down payment on a place of their own. Being a father, I opened my doors. I cleared out 2 guest rooms, gave them space, and they never left. The gap between our daily routines was the first crack in the foundation. I rise early. Every morning at 5, I am out of bed. I brew a pot of black coffee, work through the morning paper, and savor the absolute stillness of the dawn. My space stays clean, ordered, and respected. Serena and Nolan, by contrast, treat my home like a boutique hotel where invisible staff are expected to tidy up behind them. Serena never surfaces before 10 hour in the morning. When she finally drags herself out, she wanders into the kitchen, complains if I'm making the slightest noise, and fires up her expensive cloying caramel latte pods. She carries the cup into the living room, drops onto the antique sofa, and sets her dripping mug directly on Evelyn's favorite antique walnut side table. No coaster, no consideration. Day after day, I wiped away the water rings, quietly absorbing the low-grade disrespect that had seeped into every corner of my own home. The resentment truly began to calcify the day Nolan brought the new car home. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when a brand new fully loaded silver luxury SUV rolled up my driveway. Nolan climbed out of the driver's seat with a smug, arrogant swagger, tossing the keys in his hand. Serena burst through the front door, squealing and clapping as though they had just hit the jackpot. I stepped out onto the porch, wiping my hands on a towel, and asked him point blank how he had managed to afford an $85,000 vehicle while supposedly living rent-free to save for a mortgage. Nolan did not even look me in the eye. He just waved a hand dismissively and said it was a massive work bonus, a reward for outstanding performance at the logistics firm, where he holds a mid-level management post. I wanted to believe him. A father always wants to believe his son is doing well. But structural engineers do not run on hope. We run on data. 2 days later, the data arrived on its own. I was sorting through the mail on the kitchen counter when I noticed a bank statement addressed to both of us, a joint emergency savings account I had opened for Nolan when he was just 18 years old. I had seeded it with $25,000, explicitly telling him it was for absolute emergencies only. Medical bills, a sudden job loss, a genuine crisis. I opened the envelope. The balance was zero. He had drained it completely to cover the down payment and upfront lease costs on that ridiculous SUV. I stood in the kitchen holding the piece of paper that confirmed my son was a liar and a thief. A younger, more volatile man might have stormed upstairs, kicked down the bedroom door, and demanded the keys. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I folded the bank statement with care, walked into my home office, and locked the document in my safe. Through the window, I watched Nolan proudly polishing the hood of his stolen luxury car in my driveway. In that moment, my perspective shifted for good. I no longer saw Nolan as a son who needed steering. I saw him as a structural liability. The silent ledger of their offenses had officially opened, and I intended to collect every last debt. Their arrogance reached its peak on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had retreated in my study around 800, hoping to work through a historical biography in peace. Without any warning at all, the front door swung wide, and the loud grating voices of at least a dozen people flooded in. Serena had decided to throw an impromptu dinner party for her crowd. Heavy bass started thumping through the house, rattling the walls. High heels clicked across the hardwood floors, and Serena's sharp, piercing fake laughter echoed all the way down the hallway. I stayed in the study, ignoring the invasion, hoping they would confine themselves to the dining room. An hour later, my study door flew open without a knock. Serena stood in the frame in a cocktail dress holding an empty wine glass. She did not ask how I was. She did not acknowledge the noise. She fixed me with an entitled smirk and announced that her guests were running low on drinks. She told me outright to head down to the cellar and bring up 3 bottles of the good reserve red wine, as though I were the hired help. She said it loud enough for the friends clustered in the hallway to hear her giving me orders. I studied her carefully painted face. I closed my book, got to my feet, and walked downstairs to the cellar without a word. I retrieved the wine she wanted, handed it over in silence, and returned to my study, locking the door behind me. I let her enjoy her small moment of petty authority. The true breaking point came the following morning. Up at my usual 5:00, I walked into the kitchen and found a disaster zone waiting for me. Half-eaten plates of artisanal cheese and crackers sat rotting on the counters. Sticky, empty wine glasses cluttered the sink. The good pots and pans were caked with burned food tossed carelessly across the stove. I moved into the living room. The air was stale and sour, and there, dead center on Evelyn's favorite Persian rug, was a large dark stain of spilled red wine, soaked deep into the fibers and left to dry overnight. I did not wake them. I went to the utility closet, pulled out the heavy-duty carpet cleaner, filled it with hot water and solution, and carried it to the living room. I got down on my hands and knees in the quiet of the early morning. I scrubbed the rug, I cleaned the kitchen, I threw out their garbage and washed their dishes. Anyone watching might have read me as a broken old man reduced to playing housekeeper in a home he owned. They would have been completely wrong. As I worked the last of the wine from the fibers of the rug my wife had loved, my mind was perfectly clear. This was not submission. This was the meticulous, calculated sharpening of a blade. I knew precisely what I was going to do. I was going to dismantle their lives entirely, and they would not see it coming until the ground gave way completely beneath their feet. By mid-November, the air in Indiana had turned bitter and gray. The trees in my backyard stood stripped bare, their branches sharp against the freezing wind. Inside, I kept the thermostat at a comfortable level, holding on to what remained of the calm I had worked to preserve. I had spent the afternoon slow roasting a pork loin with root vegetables, a recipe Evelyn and I used to make together when the cold settled in. The smell of it filled the kitchen and offered a brief welcome warmth. Nolan and Serena came downstairs just as I was pulling the roasting pan from the oven. As usual, neither had offered to help cook or contributed a single item to the groceries. Serena swept into the kitchen with her phone fused to her hand, thumbs hammering at the screen. She dropped into a chair at the dining table without a word of greeting. Nolan shuffled in behind her, looking worn down from another day of middle management, and folded himself into the chair beside his wife. I plated everything in silence and set the dishes on the table. We ate for several minutes with no sound beyond silverware against porcelain. I preferred that quiet to Serena's commentary about her co-workers, or the coffee shop that kept getting her order wrong. But the silence that night felt heavy, loaded with something unspoken. Serena kept glancing up from her screen toward Nolan, then back down again. She took a sip of water, cleared her throat, and set the phone face down on the table. "I'm finalizing the holiday itinerary," she said, her tone as breezy and dismissive as if she were commenting on the forecast. "Just wanted to give you a heads up about Christmas this year." I kept my eyes on my plate and went on cutting my food. "A heads up," I repeated slowly. Yes, she went on, settling back in her chair with an air of total entitlement. My family usually rents a ski lodge or heads down to a resort, but this year everyone decided they wanted a traditional, cozy home-style Christmas, so I offered to host them here. I stopped chewing. I set my fork down on the table. The sheer audacity of the word host rang in my head. She was offering to host a gathering in a house she did not own without so much as a word to the man who paid the property taxes. I see, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. And exactly how many people are we expecting for this cozy gathering? Serena waved her hand through the air, brushing the question aside, as though it were a trivial detail. Oh, nothing crazy. Just the immediate extended family. My parents, my 2 sisters, and their husbands, the kids, my Uncle Harvey, and his new wife, some cousins. It is only about 30 people. They are flying in on the 20th and staying through the day after Christmas. 30 people for a full week. I let that number settle. 30 loud, demanding, entitled strangers trampling through my hallways, scuffing the hardwood floors, breaking dishes, and treating my home like a free bed and breakfast. My mind went straight to the logistics of fitting 36 people into a 4-bedroom house. It would be pure chaos. Before I could even begin to respond, Serena reached into the pocket of her designer cardigan and produced a thick, neatly folded stack of heavy cardstock paper. She did not hand it to me. She slid it across the polished dining table, letting it come to rest right beside my dinner plate. Since I am going to be completely tied up handling the aesthetic and the decor, she said, her voice honeyed with artificial sweetness, I need you to take care of the shopping this week. I looked down at the papers. I did not reach for them right away. I just took in the neatly printed lines of text. It is quite a list, she added, folding her arms across her chest. But we want everything to be perfect. My parents have very specific tastes. You know how they are. I picked up the stack of paper. It was nothing like a normal grocery list. A normal grocery list has milk, eggs, bread, maybe a turkey, or a ham for the holiday table. This was a sprawling multi-page manifesto of luxury consumption. I scanned the first page. It called for 3 massive prime rib roasts exclusively from a high-end organic butcher downtown. The second page was devoted entirely to dairy and charcuterie imported, French brie, aged Italian Gouda, artisanal water crackers, fresh black truffles. I turned to the final page where she had laid out the beverages. She had requested 6 bottles of a specific aged single malt scotch, a brand I knew retailed for over $180 a bottle. She had also listed premium Scotch craft beers and imported sparkling waters. I ran a quick mental calculation. The food alone would run into the thousands. The alcohol would double that figure. She was pushing a bill for somewhere around $5,000 across my dining table and expecting me to cover it. I looked up from the list and met her eyes. You want me to purchase all of this? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Well, yes, she sighed, rolling her eyes as though I were being willfully obtuse. I literally just told you I don't have the time. I have to coordinate the matching family pajamas, hire a photographer for Christmas Eve, and work out the floral arrangements for the dining room. I am exhausted just thinking about it. Nolan finally decided to say something. His voice was soft and placating, the sound of a man who had surrendered every last scrap of his dignity. Come on, Dad, he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. It would be a huge help. You have the big trunk in your car for the groceries, and you have all that free time during the day. It is the holidays. We should all pitch in. Pitch in. The phrase tasted like ash. They were not asking me to pitch in. They were directing me to finance and execute a luxury banquet for people I barely knew and actively disliked. Serena and her parents were cut from exactly the same cloth, arrogant and superficial to the core. The last time they visited her father had criticized the brand of coffee I served while sitting on a sofa I had paid for. I looked at Serena. She was practically radiating smug satisfaction, convinced she had won. She believed that because I had stayed quiet for 3 years, because I had scrubbed wine stains and paid utility bills, without raising my voice, I was a broken, compliant old man. She thought I was nothing more than a convenient wallet and an unpaid servant. I held the multi-page grocery list in my hands. The paper felt heavy, weighted with the full measure of their disrespect. I could have thrown it back across the table. I could have shouted. I could have told them to pack their bags and be out of my house that very night. But an explosive reaction would only hand them ammunition to paint me as the unreasonable one. A structural engineer understands that the most devastating collapses do not announce themselves with a loud bang. They happen in complete silence when the support beams are quietly pulled away, one by one, until the whole structure buckles under its own weight. I folded the list neatly along its original creases. I slipped it into the breast pocket of my shirt. I looked at Serena, then at Nolan. I let a slow, agreeable smile move across my face. "I understand," I said evenly. "You are absolutely right. You have a great deal on your plate with the decorations. I will handle the shopping." Serena broke into a wide smile and let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief. "Thank goodness," she said, already reaching for her phone. "Make sure you get to the butcher by Thursday. They run out of the good cuts if you wait until the weekend." I gave a single nod. I picked up my empty plate, carried it to the sink, and washed it in silence. I walked out of the kitchen, feeling their eyes on my back, two people with absolutely no idea they had just handed me the tools I needed to take apart their entire lives. I stood at the kitchen sink, letting warm water run over my hands. The heavy cardstock of the grocery list sat tucked in my breast pocket, pressing against my chest, like a physical testament to their audacity. I thought the conversation was finished. I thought the demands had reached their ceiling for the evening. I reached for a dish towel, drying my hands with slow, deliberate strokes, but the sound of Serena tapping her manicured nails against the dining table cut through the quiet. She was not done. "Oh, there is one more logistical thing we need to sort out," she said, her voice utterly free of hesitation. "It is about the sleeping arrangements." I did not turn around right away. I folded the dish towel carefully and hung it over the oven handle. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself for whatever fresh indignity she had engineered. When I finally turned to face her, she was already scrolling through her phone, not even glancing up while she spoke. "So, I have mapped out where everyone is going to sleep." She continued, gesturing loosely toward the hallway. "The kids will be in sleeping bags in the living room. My sister and her husband are in the east guest room. My brother gets the west guest room. The cousins will be on air mattresses in the home office." She paused, finally lifting her eyes from the screen. She pressed her lips into a tight, thin line. "But that leaves my parents. And frankly, Gerald, the guest rooms simply are not suitable for them. They are getting older. My mother has a bad back and cannot be expected to walk down the hall to a shared bathroom in the middle of the night. That is not hospitable. We are hosting them, and they require their own private attached bathroom. They need the master suite." The words hung in the air. The master suite, my bedroom, the room I had shared with Evelyn for 40 years. It was not merely a place to sleep. It was a sanctuary built on 4 decades of marriage. It was the room where Evelyn and I had sat up late into the night, talking about Nolan's future when he was still just a little boy. It was where we had laughed, where we had wept. And ultimately, it was the room where I had held Evelyn's hand as she drew her final breath. Everything inside those walls was sacred to me. The heavy oak dresser we had picked up at an estate sale on our 5th anniversary, the reading chair by the bay window, where Evelyn used to sit with her morning tea. That room was a living museum of my life, with the woman I had loved, and Serena wanted me to vacate it so her parents could use it like a complimentary suite at a hotel. I stared at her, trying to absorb the sheer scale of her entitlement. "I see," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "And if your parents are occupying my bedroom, where exactly do you expect me to sleep for the duration of this week-long visit?" "Und wir baba Spain stand." Bites. Serena did not even blink. "Well, I was thinking you could just take the pull-out couch down in the basement. It is only for a few days and you are an early riser anyway, so you will not be in anyone's way down there. It just makes the most logistical sense. The basement." She wanted to exile me to the unfinished basement in the middle of an Indiana winter. That basement was essentially a concrete box where I stored holiday decorations, old paint cans, and seasonal tools. It was drafty, damp, and cold year-round, and the pull-out couch she was referring to was a battered piece of furniture I had bought 30 years ago for a hunting cabin. The mattress was paper-thin, stained with age, and carried a faint smell of mildew. Worse, there was a broken metal spring right in the center that drove itself into the back of anyone unlucky enough to lie on it. She was sending me to sleep on a broken metal spring in a freezing concrete room, while strangers occupied the bed I had shared with my late wife. A slow, cold fire took hold in the center of my chest. Not the hot, blinding fury of a younger man, the precise, absolute clarity of an engineer watching a bridge give way under a load it was never meant to carry. There was no coming back from this. The line had not merely been crossed, it had been wiped from the map entirely. But before I said a word, I shifted my gaze away from Serena and looked squarely at my son. Nolan was sitting right there at the table. He had heard every single word. He knew what that bedroom meant to me. He knew how deeply I still mourned his mother. He knew the condition of that freezing, unfinished basement. I stared at him and waited. I was giving him one final chance to be a man, one last opportunity to find his spine, to stand up and tell his wife she had gone too far. I needed him to say that his father would not be treated like a stray dog in his own home. Nolan felt the weight of my stare. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, shoulders rounding forward. He picked up his fork and began nudging a leftover piece of roasted carrot around his plate. He would not meet my eyes. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. The tension in that room was palpable, pressing against the walls. I waited. I watched him physically collapse under the combined pressure of his wife's dominating will and his own bottomless cowardice. Finally, Nolan opened his mouth. What came out was a weak, pathetic mumble. "Come on, Dad," he said, eyes fixed on the scratches in his ceramic plate. "It is really not that big of a deal. It is only for a week, Dad. Just let them have the room. It will make things easier for everyone." "It is only for a week, Dad." Those 7 words sealed his fate. In that moment, the last remaining thread of a paternal obligation I felt toward my son dissolved completely. I looked at the top of his bowed head and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no disappointment, just the cold, sterile detachment of a man deciding to discard a broken tool that cannot be repaired. He was no longer a son to protect. He was just another squatter living in my property. I looked back at Serena. She was practically glowing with victory. She had pushed to the ultimate boundary and encountered zero resistance. She had confirmed for herself that she was the unchallenged authority in my home and that my son would serve willingly as her foot soldier. I let out a slow, even breath. I smoothed the front of my shirt. I looked at the 2 of them seated at the dining table, the table I had paid for, the table where I had fed Nolan every evening of his childhood. I arranged my lips into a polite, cooperative smile. "You make a very practical point, Serena." I said, my voice smooth and untroubled. "Logistically speaking, it does make sense. I would not want your parents to be uncomfortable navigating the hallway at night. I will clear out my personal items from the master suite this weekend and set up in the basement." Serena clapped her hands together with a sharp, ringing crack of triumph. "Perfect," she said brightly, pulling out her phone. "I knew you would understand, Gerald. I am going to text my mom right now and let her know she gets the big room with the jacuzzi tub. She is going to be so thrilled." Nolan finally lifted his eyes from his plate and offered me a weak, apologetic smile. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured. "I appreciate it." I did not say you are welcome. I simply turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. I reached the door of my private study, the one room in the house I kept strictly locked. I turned the key, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the dark, still space. I did not switch on the overhead light. I crossed to my heavy oak desk and clicked on the small, brass-based reading lamp. I lowered myself into my leather chair and sat staring at the phone on the edge of the desk. They thought they had won. They imagined they had successfully reduced me to a ghost rattling around the basement of my own home. But as I reached out and lifted the receiver, I knew the truth clearly. They had not won a single thing. They had simply accelerated their own destruction. I dialed the direct private number for Clifton, my estate attorney, and listened to the line ring. It was time to initiate the collapse. The glass of ice water sat on the table, condensing in the warm kitchen air. I reached for it with slow, deliberate control. My fingers closed around the cold surface, the moisture pressing against my skin. I lifted it and took a long, measured sip. The icy water moved down my throat, cooling the fire threatening to burn through my chest. An untrained man, an emotional man, would have slammed the glass down right then. He would have raised his voice, face going red, demanding respect, citing property rights, expecting gratitude for the roof over their heads. But shouting signals a loss of control. It tells your opponent they have found your weak point and broken through. I am not that man. I am an engineer. I know how to hold immense pressure without showing a single crack on the surface. I set the glass down gently on the wooden table, making no sound at all. I looked at the multi-page grocery list sitting near my plate. I picked it up, folded it precisely, and slipped it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I looked across the table at the woman who had invaded my home and the son who had stood aside and let her. I let my face go still. I softened the corners of my eyes. I pulled my lips back into a warm, agreeable, entirely manufactured smile. A smile of total submission. "I understand, Serena," I said, keeping my tone gentle and unhurried. "You are right. Your parents are older, and they should not have to navigate a dark hallway in the night. The master suite is the most logical choice for their comfort. I will begin clearing out my personal things tomorrow morning, so the room is ready for their arrival. I can manage perfectly well on the pull-out couch in the basement. It will give everyone the space needed for a proper family Christmas. And I will take care of this shopping list. You focus on the decorations and getting the house looking festive for your relatives." The shift in their body language was immediate and pitiful to observe. Serena let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, her rigid posture softening as she sank back into her dining chair. A smug, triumphant glow moved across her face. She looked at me not with any gratitude or appreciation, but with the condescending approval a master reserves for a well-behaved dog. She genuinely believed she had won the war. She was convinced that her sheer force of will and grinding entitlement had finally broken the stubborn old man down and molded him into a docile, obedient butler. Beside her, Nolan visibly deflated into his chair. The nervous tension drained from his shoulders, and he offered me a weak, cowardly grin. "Thanks, Dad," he mumbled, pushing his empty plate aside. "We really appreciate it. It is just going to make the holidays so much less stressful for everyone." They had completely misread the situation. They mistook my silence for surrender. They took my compliance as proof that I had abandoned my dignity and accepted a permanent place at the bottom of the household order. What they failed to grasp is that a man who has spent 40 years calculating the precise breaking point of steel beams and concrete pillars does not simply buckle under the weight of an entitled daughter-in-law. He redirects the load. He reinforces his own foundation, and then he quietly pulls away the supports holding up the structure on the other side. They imagined themselves as clever strategists claiming my home room by room, but they were just two arrogant squatters dancing blindly over a trapdoor I was about to open. I rose from the table, gathered my empty dinner plate, and carried it to the sink. I washed it quietly under the running water, listening to Serena already chattering at Nolan about ordering matching silk pajamas for her sisters and nephews. She was already scheming about how to rearrange the heavy antique furniture in my bedroom to better suit her parents' modern sensibilities. I dried my hands on a cotton towel, folded it, and hung it over the oven handle. "Have a good evening, you two," I said softly without turning around. I walked out of the kitchen and moved down the long, dimly lit hallway toward my private study. The house was quiet in this wing, well away from the obnoxious sound of Serena cataloging her holiday grievances. I passed the framed photographs lining the walls, Evelyn smiling brilliantly on our back porch. A young Nolan balanced on a wooden bicycle I had built for him with my own two hands. Images of a family that no longer existed anywhere, but in fading ink and glossy paper. I did not feel sorrow looking at them. I felt a deep settled clarity. I reached the heavy solid oak door of my study, the one room in the entire house where Serena was strictly forbidden, and she knew it was locked at all times. I drew the heavy brass key from my pocket, fitted it into the lock, and turned it. The satisfying metallic click of the tumbler releasing was the only sound in the corridor. I stepped inside, pushed the door firmly closed behind me, and locked it from within. The study was cool and carried the faint scent of old paper, cedar, wood, and leather. I moved to my large mahogany desk and switched on the brass-based reading lamp. A soft pool of yellow light spread across the polished surface, falling over the neat stacks of engineering blueprints and financial ledgers. Right there in the dead center of the desk sat my leather-bound checkbook, exactly where it always lived. In the past, when an unexpected expense arose or Nolan stumbled into another crisis, I would drop heavily into that chair crack, the book open, and write a substantial check to make his problem disappear. I had done it for his out-of-state college tuition. I had done it for his first car after he destroyed the starter vehicle. I had done it for his extravagant destination wedding to Serena. That checkbook had become the enduring symbol of my bottomless paternal patience and my own enabling hand. I stood there looking down at the worn leather cover. My hand drifted toward it for just a fraction of a second, old muscle memory nudging me to simply pay for the groceries and preserve the peace through one more holiday season. Then I drew my hand back slowly and pressed my fingers into a fist. I was finished writing checks. I was done funding my own humiliation and paying for my own disrespect. I walked past the checkbook entirely, leaving it sitting untouched in the pool of light. Instead, I reached for the heavy black desk telephone on the far corner of the desk. I did not need to consult my address book for the number. I had carried it in my memory for over 20 years. It was the direct private line for Clifton. Clifton was not a warm family friend. He was not a man who offered comfort or sympathy. He was my estate attorney, and he was arguably the most ruthless corporate lawyer in the state of Indiana. Clifton specialized in high net worth asset protection, irrevocable blind trusts, and brutal property settlements. He was a cold, precise shark in a custom-tailored suit, and he had spent the last 3 years advising me to cut Nolan off financially before they bled me completely dry. I had always pushed back, insisting that Nolan just needed more time to find his footing and grow up. But time had officially run out. I picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the sequence of numbers, listening to the mechanical whir of the dial spinning back after each digit. The line rang twice before a sharp, gravelly voice came through the static on the other end. "Clifton speaking!" the voice barked. I drew a slow breath, feeling the cold, clinical focus of a master engineer, preparing to bring down a condemned structure. "Clifton, it is Gerald," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even pitch that carried across the still study. "You were right about the boy. I need you to draft the severances immediately. We are tearing the whole thing down." The heavy brass key sat cold in my pocket as I returned to my desk. I had just set down the phone with a Clifton, and the quiet inside my study felt absolute, the particular stillness that settles after a consequential decision has been made. I felt no guilt, no hesitation. I slid my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and sat down before my computer. The screen came to life, casting a pale blue glow across the mahogany surface. I pulled up my internet browser and navigated to the portal for my primary banking institution. For more than a decade, I had managed my finances with the same exacting discipline I brought to designing structural steel columns. Every dollar tracked every expense justified. But for the past 3 years, I had allowed a serious widening leak to form in my own financial foundation. That leak had a name: my son Nolan and his wife Serena. Tonight, I was sealing it for good. I entered my master password and waited for the dashboard to populate. The screen filled with a long list of checking and savings accounts. My eyes went straight to the joint checking account I had set up for Nolan when he finished college. It was meant as a transitional tool, something to help him cover his first apartment and put a reliable car under him. A temporary bridge to adult life. Instead, it had calcified into a permanent crutch. I clicked into the account and scrolled through the recent transaction history. It was a depressing record of a grown man who refused to carry his own weight. Expensive dinners at downtown steakhouses, monthly subscriptions to luxury grooming boxes, and premium car wash services for a leased vehicle he had no business owning. He had treated this account as a personal slush fund, fully aware that I would transfer funds automatically to keep it from going negative. Every dollar in those accounts stood for hours of my life. Long nights bent over structural blueprints, early mornings driving to construction sites in freezing rain, the vacations Evelyn and I had set aside so we could build something lasting for our family. I was not about to watch a spoiled woman and a spineless boy burn through that legacy on vanity purchases. The money was mine, and I was reclaiming it. I moved my cursor to the Account Management tab. The site presented a security prompt, asking whether I was certain I wanted to remove an authorized user. I did not blink. I clicked Confirm. Just like that, Nolan was severed entirely from the primary wealth I had spent a lifetime accumulating. I repeated the same sequence for the backup savings account and the shared emergency fund. I revoked his transfer privileges. I changed the routing passwords. With a handful of quiet mouse clicks, I had dismantled the invisible safety net that had been breaking my son's every fall whenever he decided to leap without looking. He was now financially on his own, no floor beneath him, no net below that. It was a strangely liberating sensation. For years, I had shouldered the dead weight of his financial recklessness, telling myself that a devoted father always steps in. But a devoted father also recognizes when he is feeding poison to a sick patient. Easy money was the poison that had crippled his development, and I was shutting off the tap. Once Nolan was isolated, I shifted my focus to a far more parasitic problem. I opened a fresh tab and signed into my premium credit card portal. When Serena and Nolan first moved in, under the pretense of saving money, Serena had graciously requested a supplementary card. She told me it was strictly for household groceries and cleaning supplies, easier, she said, than coming to me for cash every time she needed milk or laundry detergent. Being a generous host, I had agreed and ordered a card with her name printed beneath my primary account. I had set a very generous limit on it, trusting her to conduct herself like a responsible adult. I clicked into the transaction history for her card and felt a cold smile tug at the corners of my mouth. Serena had a remarkably elastic definition of household groceries. The ledger read like a running tab of pure vanity and unchecked excess. Charges for expensive nail salons, premium skincare boutiques, and upscale department stores filled every page. Just the week prior, she had put $450 at a luxury handbag boutique on my account. Earlier that same month, there was a substantial charge from a high-end day spa, where she had apparently treated herself and a friend to a full afternoon of massages and facials. I scrolled through page after page of these transactions. She was using my money to project a lifestyle to her social media following. I suppose she believed I simply paid the monthly total without ever reviewing the itemized breakdown. She had decided I was a foolish old man who could not navigate a digital banking statement. She was badly mistaken. I studied her spending patterns carefully, noting the specific days and times she typically ran her shopping sprees. My cursor hovered over the option to immediately freeze and cancel her supplementary card. But an engineer does not drop a wrecking ball without first mapping the exact trajectory of the collapse. If I canceled the card that night, she would receive a digital notification or an email alert by morning. That would give her time to adjust, time to confront me, and time to devise a fresh strategy for extracting money from her husband. She would simply reach for Nolan's credit card, or she would throw a tantrum and demand I restore her privileges before her family descended on the house. I wanted her to feel the full, unmitigated weight of her financial reality in the most public settings possible. I wanted the floor to give way precisely when she was leaning her full weight upon it. I navigated away from the cancellation button and opened the advanced security settings. This particular premium card offered a suite of granular controls for managing supplementary users, a feature designed for wealthy parents to manage dependent children, but perfectly suited to my present situation. I set a highly specific lock on her card. I programmed the system to automatically decline any transaction exceeding $50. Then I scheduled a complete hard cancellation of the physical card to trigger in exactly 48 hours. The timing would coincide perfectly with the massive holiday grocery run she had outlined for me. I knew exactly how Serena operated. She would wait until the absolute last minute to secure the imported cheeses, the prime rib, and the expensive liquor. She would stride into the most exclusive grocery store in town, stack her cart with luxury items, and saunter up to the register, fully expecting my card to absorb the bill. By programming the cancellation on a time delay, I was guaranteeing that her humiliation would be complete and inescapable. The card would decline while she stood in a long line of well-heeled holiday shoppers. She would be forced to produce her own credit cards, the ones carrying punishing interest rates and massive balances. She would have to drain her own accounts to feed the 30 relatives she had so generously invited into my home. I leaned back in my leather chair and listened to the quiet hum of the computer tower. The glowing screen was the sole source of light in the room, throwing long shadows across the bookshelves. I had just dismantled their entire financial ecosystem without raising my voice, without slamming a single door, and without giving them any warning at all. I had pulled out the pillars, the beams, and the foundation. The only thing holding their lives upright at that moment was the sheer momentum of their own ignorance. They were sleeping upstairs, completely unaware that their luxury lifestyle had just been switched off. The invisible walls of their false reality were gone. I closed the laptop, folded my reading glasses, and switched off the brass-based reading lamp. The study dissolved into darkness, but I had never seen the path ahead more clearly. Tomorrow, I would begin the physical extraction, packing away my life, packing away the memories of Evelyn, and preparing for my permanent departure. I sat in the dark a few minutes longer, letting the silence settle over me. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a deep and genuine peace. I was no longer a hostage in my own home. I was the architect of their coming ruin. The morning sun barely cut through the heavy gray clouds as I watched Nolan and Serena back out of the driveway. Their silver luxury SUV crunched across the frosted gravel and disappeared down the suburban street. The moment the taillights vanished, I locked the front door. The house dropped into a deep, familiar quiet. For 3 years, I had spent my days retreating from the chaos they left in their wake, hiding in my study or the garden. But today my role had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a retired engineer passing time in his old house. I was a man executing a meticulous strategic extraction. I had exactly 3 weeks until the holiday invasion, and I needed every single hour. I started in the master bedroom the sanctuary Serena had so casually demanded I surrender. Standing at the center of the room, I looked at the life Evelyn and I had built together. To an ordinary person, packing up 40 years of memories would be an emotional ordeal, crying over photograph albums, clinging to sentimental keepsakes. But I had already shed my tears for Evelyn 7 years ago. I knew she was not in the walls of this house. She was not in the expensive hardwood floors or the vaulted ceilings. Her memory lived inside me. The objects we had gathered over a lifetime were just material possessions. But they were my material possessions, and I refused to let a pack of entitled strangers mishandle them. I retrieved a stack of heavy-duty moving boxes I had hidden in the back of my closet and began with the valuables. Evelyn had kept a beautiful collection of antique jewelry and delicate porcelain figurines sourced from estate sales across the country. I wrapped each piece carefully in thick layers of bubble wrap, packing them snugly so nothing would shift in transit. I moved to the walls next, taking down the original oil paintings we had purchased on our 10th anniversary trip to the coast. I emptied the safe in my study, transferring the deeds, birth certificates, bonds, and irreplaceable family documents into a secure locked briefcase. An extraction of this scale demanded absolute secrecy. If Serena walked in and found bare walls and empty shelves, she would immediately sense something was wrong. She would throw a fit, demand answers, and potentially try to claim my belongings as part of the household. So I approached it like a structural illusionist. An engineer understands that as long as the facade appears intact, people rarely trouble themselves with the foundation. Over the following days, I visited several local thrift stores and discount shops on the far side of town. I bought terrible generic landscape prints in flimsy plastic frames. I bought mass-produced ceramic vases and cheap glass bowls. When I took down one of Evelyn's beautiful oil paintings, I hung a worthless discount print in its exact place. When I packed away her heavy silver tea set, I replaced it with a polished tin knockoff that looked convincing enough from a distance. I arranged the decoys with absolute precision, recreating the general look and feel of each room. The illusion was flawlessly executed. Serena was an incredibly superficial woman. She examined only the surface of things, never possessing the depth to inspect the details. She walked past the fake paintings and the cheap ceramic vases every single evening, completely blind to the fact that the genuine treasures had been quietly evacuated. She was too busy scrolling her phone and complaining about coworkers to notice that the soul of the house was being steadily drained away. My daily operation ran on a strict schedule. I packed and swapped items from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. At 3:30, I loaded the sealed boxes into the trunk of my reliable sedan and drove across town to a high-end climate-controlled storage facility, where I had rented a large secure unit under a corporate alias. The facility required dual passcode entry and biometric scanning, ensuring that no one could ever trace my assets. I stacked the heavy cardboard boxes inside the metal unit, organizing them with mathematical efficiency. Every trip felt like carrying another piece of my freedom across the finish line. By the second week, the house was essentially a hollow shell. The heavy oak furniture remained, but every drawer was completely empty. The closets held only the clothes I needed for the next 2 weeks. Everything else, my winter coats, my formal suits, my vintage watch collection, was sitting safely in the storage unit. The physical weight of the house grew lighter with each passing day. One Tuesday afternoon, I was taping up a medium-sized box in the living room when the front door abruptly swung open. Serena had decided to leave her part-time job early. I did not panic. I did not scramble to hide the packing tape. I simply straightened up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and held a calm, unhurried posture. She came into the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped, dropped her expensive handbag onto an armchair, and looked at the cardboard box sitting at my feet. One eyebrow went up, her hands landed on her hips. I offered her a polite, tired smile. I told her I was getting a head start on clearing out some of the old clutter before her parents arrived, that I wanted to make sure they had plenty of room in the closets and that the house felt open and welcoming for the holidays. Her suspicious look dissolved instantly into a wide, self-satisfied grin. She actually clapped her hands together, delighted by what she took as pure submission. She called it a fantastic idea. She mentioned she had been meaning to tell me the house felt overcrowded with old junk. She even praised me for finally taking some initiative and making the place presentable for her relatives. She suggested I also clear out some of the books in the hallway since her mother couldn't stand the smell of old paper. I nodded agreeably and told her I would handle it right away. I watched her climb the stairs, humming a cheerful tune, completely convinced of her total authority over my life. She genuinely believed I was dismantling my own history just to accommodate her mother's preferences. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to laugh out loud in that empty room. She had handed me the perfect cover story on a silver platter. My covert extraction was no longer a clandestine operation. It was an officially sanctioned household chore. The final week of packing was almost effortless. Since Serena had explicitly given me permission to remove clutter, I no longer needed to conceal the boxes at all. I carried them straight out the front door in broad daylight. I cleared out my entire workshop in the garage, leaving behind only a few rusted screwdrivers and empty paint cans. I emptied the kitchen cabinets of the good crystal and the expensive silverware, leaving only cheap everyday plates and mismatched forks. If 30 people were going to descend on this house, they could eat off generic ceramic and drink from basic glass. I was not leaving a single item of value for them to scratch, chip, or pocket. On the final trip to the storage unit, I stood before the rolling metal door and surveyed the neatly stacked columns of my life. 40 years of hard work, of marriage, of raising a child, all safely contained within those corrugated cardboard walls. The unit was cool, dry, and perfectly ordered. I pulled the heavy metal door down and secured it with a thick steel padlock. When I drove back to the house that evening, the structure looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The brick facade was solid. The lawn was neat. But the moment I stepped through the front door and into the foyer, the air felt different. The acoustics had shifted. The house sounded faintly hollow, carrying a slight echo from the emptiness I had so methodically engineered. It was no longer a home. It was just a building, a perfectly staged movie set, waiting for the final act of a disaster film. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a plain glass of water. The trap was set, the valuables were secure, and the foundation had been completely severed. All that remained was to wait for the occupants to pull the final lever. The steakhouse downtown was precisely the kind of establishment Nolan and Serena would photograph for social media, but could never genuinely afford. The lighting was strikingly dim, casting long shadows across the dark mahogany-paneled walls and the deep leather booths. The air carried the scent of aged beef, roasted garlic, and very expensive scotch. It was the sort of place where quiet conversations moved millions of dollars across tables before the appetizers arrived. I handed my winter coat to the host and made my way toward the private corner booth, where Clifton was already settled. Clifton did not look like a man who spent his days filing paperwork. He had the look of a predator at rest in a tailored Italian suit. He held a glass of neat bourbon in one hand, and a thick leather portfolio sat on the table before him. He did not smile when I took my seat. Clifton and I had left polite formalities behind decades ago. We respected one another because we both operated entirely on logic and flawless execution. I ordered a glass of water and a bone-in strip steak. I was not drinking alcohol that evening. I needed my mind working with absolute mathematical clarity. Clifton took a slow sip and tapped one manicured finger against the leather portfolio. He studied me with those sharp gray eyes of his. "You know Gerald," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I have been your attorney for a very long time. I have watched you build your wealth, and I have watched you protect your family. But I must admit, I was beginning to think you would never actually make this call. I was starting to believe you were going to let that boy bleed you entirely dry." I unfolded my linen napkin and laid it across my lap. "A structural collapse is a matter of timing," Clifton I replied. "If you detonate the charges too early, the building falls the wrong way and damages everything around it. You have to wait until the internal load is perfectly balanced before you pull the final pin." Clifton let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. He appreciated the metaphor. He slid the leather portfolio across the smooth wooden table. "Let's talk about the load then," he said. For the past 5 years, a luxury commercial real estate developer had been relentlessly pursuing my property. They had sent letters. They had called Clifton's office, and they had made increasingly frantic cash offers. My double lot sat at the precise intersection they needed to complete a massive zoning block. Their intention was to tear down the house and build a highly exclusive boutique condominium complex for wealthy retirees. I had known this was coming. Every few months, a glossy envelope would appear in my mailbox, dangling an astronomical sum of money in exchange for vacating the premises. I had always fed those letters directly to the fireplace. I had always instructed Clifton to reject their offers without even glancing at the figures. To me, that property was not a financial asset. It was the physical embodiment of my life with Evelyn. It was the garden she planted. It was the patio we built together. It was sacred ground. But sitting in the dim warmth of the steakhouse, something shifted in me. The sacred ground had been desecrated by contempt. The garden was just dirt. The patio was just concrete. Evelyn was not there anymore. What remained in that house were 2 greedy squatters and the looming arrival of 30 arrogant strangers. I opened the portfolio. The contract was substantial, dense, with legal terminology that would have bewildered an ordinary man. But I had spent 40 years parsing municipal building codes and union contracts. I knew exactly what I was reading. The developer was offering millions of dollars in a clean cash transaction. No financing contingencies. No structural inspections required since they intended to level the entire structure anyway. It was the cleanest, most lucrative exit a man could ever hope for. I worked through the standard clauses registering the purchase price. It was enough to acquire a luxury penthouse anywhere in the world, and still leave millions generating compounding interest. But the money was merely a pleasing side effect. The true value of this contract was the absolute unmitigated annihilation of Serena and Nolan's false reality. I turned to the second section of the document, where the dates and transfer logistics were laid out. This was the critical junction. I looked up at Clifton. "The financial terms are acceptable," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But the execution timeline must be modified. I have very specific parameters for the handover." Clifton leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Name your terms," he said. "The developer is so desperate to secure this parcel, they will agree to practically anything you demand." "I need the final closing date set for December 26th, I told him. "I want to remain the legal owner of the property through the Christmas holiday. But the moment the clock strikes midnight on the 26th, the title must officially transfer to their corporate holding company. They must assume absolute legal possession of both the structure and the land." Clifton narrowed his eyes, turning the specific date over in his mind. He knew exactly what I was doing. He knew Serena had invited her entire extended family to occupy the house for the holiday week. A slow, dangerous smile worked its way across his face. "Consider it done," he murmured, making a quick notation on his legal pad. "What else?" "The utilities." I continued holding his gaze. "This is the most crucial structural component. I want my name stripped completely from the water, gas, and electricity accounts. I want those accounts closed and fully transferred to the developer's corporate management division on the morning of December 23rd. I want it stipulated in this contract that the developer assumes all responsibility for the utilities 3 days before the final property handover." Clifton stopped writing. He looked up at me. His expression caught somewhere between professional admiration and genuine shock. "Gerald," he said quietly, "if we transfer those utilities to a commercial demolition company on December 23rd, they are not going to keep the heat running. Corporate protocol for a condemned structure is an immediate hard shutoff. They will cut the gas and the power to eliminate any liability before the bulldozers roll in. You will be leaving the occupants to freeze in the middle of an Indiana winter." I picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the contract and rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "I am well aware of commercial demolition protocols, Clifton," I replied, my voice entirely free of sympathy. "I am not subjecting them to anything. I am simply withdrawing my financial support. If they wish to host 30 people for a luxury holiday, they are more than welcome to sort out how to keep them warm." Clifton let out a low whistle. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. By transferring the utility accounts to a faceless corporation, I was removing myself from the equation entirely. When the heat died and the pipes froze, Serena and Nolan would not be able to call the gas company and demand restoration. The utility provider would simply inform them that they were not the authorized property owners and that the accounts had been flagged for demolition. They would be stranded in a cold, dark house with 30 furious relatives and absolutely no legal avenue to remedy the situation. They would be forced to confront the exact truth of their circumstances. They owned nothing. They controlled nothing. They were guests who had long since overstayed their welcome. I clicked the silver pen open and turned to the final page of the contract where the signature lines waited. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single tremor of regret or nostalgia. I pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name in firm, deliberate strokes. I initialed the riders. I signed the transfer authorizations. With every mark of ink, I severed another connection to the parasitic existence I had been enduring. Our steaks arrived shortly after the last document was signed. The waiter set the sizzling cuts before us, and the scent of rosemary and butter rose into the air. We ate in easy, companionable silence. The deal was done. The trap was perfectly assembled, and the clock was counting down. As we finished our meal, Clifton gathered the signed documents and returned them to his leather briefcase. He looked across the table at me and raised his glass of bourbon in a wordless toast. "It has been a pleasure doing business with you, Gerald," he said. "The developer will be thrilled. The utility transfer will be executed precisely on the 23rd, and the property manager will conduct a final walkthrough on the 24th to confirm the structure is secure for demolition." I pressed the linen napkin to my mouth and set it on the table. In my mind, I could already see the property manager arriving on Christmas Eve, clipboard in hand, expecting an empty house only to find Serena Nolan and 30 shivering relatives huddled in the dark. It would be the final catastrophic collapse of their counterfeit kingdom. I rose from the booth for the full meal and a generous tip. "Thank you, Clifton," I said, buttoning my coat. "I have a flight to Park City to catch in a few weeks, and one final grocery list to ignore." The 20th of December arrived on the back of a bitter, biting wind that rattled the window panes throughout the house. Outside, the sky was a flat, unforgiving gray, heavy with the promise of snow before dark. Inside, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The house was practically humming with frantic, chaotic energy. Serena was in full command mode, conducting herself less like a hostess preparing for the season, and more like a tyrannical general readying for a military siege. Her family, 30 of the most entitled, demanding people I had ever had the misfortune of encountering, was set to arrive in exactly 48 hours, and the approaching invasion had transformed my once peaceful home into a high-pressure war zone. I sat in my leather armchair by the fireplace, taking in the spectacle with the quiet detachment of someone watching a slow-motion car accident unfold. Serena was pacing across the living room, her heels striking the hardwood in sharp, rapid bursts. She had a tablet in one hand and a clipboard in the other, issuing orders at Nolan, who was darting around like a cornered animal. He was hauling heavy boxes of holiday decorations up from the basement, sweating and looking thoroughly miserable. He clipped a doorway and dropped a box of glass ornaments, and Serena shrieked at him, immediately dressing down his clumsiness in a tone that briefly stirred something resembling pity in me. But it dissolved at once. He had chosen this life. He had chosen to let her rule him. Her fixation on appearances was reaching a fever pitch. She had hired a professional cleaning crew the day before, charging it to the supplementary card she still believed was fully operational to scrub the entire house from floor to ceiling. She had ordered fresh winter floral arrangements for every available surface. She was running herself into the ground, constructing a seamless illusion of great wealth and domestic mastery. She wanted her parents and siblings to step through the front door and believe they were entering the residence of the undisputed queen of the suburbs. I sat in perfect silence watching her spin her fragile web. I knew the foundation beneath it had long since ceased to exist. The credit card she thought she was wielding had been systematically throttled. The house she was adorning no longer belonged to me, let alone to her. The heating system she was counting on to keep her guests comfortable was scheduled for permanent corporate termination in just 3 days. She was meticulously arranging the deck chairs on a vessel that was already halfway beneath the water. Just before noon, Serena finally spotted me, sitting quietly by the fire. She halted her frantic circuit and came straight at my chair, face flushed with stress, eyes lit with a manic, demanding energy. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how I was. She simply held out a thick folded sheet of heavy paper and pushed it toward my chest. "This is the final updated grocery list," she said, her voice clipped and short of breath. "I added several more things last night after speaking with my mother. She decided she wants a specific type of imported smoked salmon for the Christmas Eve appetizer spread, and my uncle will only drink a very particular brand of artisanal gin. I need you to go now. Don't wait until tomorrow. The shelves will be completely picked over by the weekend, and I absolutely cannot have my family eating generic brand garbage. I looked at the thick paper in her hand. Through the back of it, I could see the dense lines of ink bleeding through. It was a manifesto of entitlement. It was the physical expression of her conviction that my sole purpose on this earth was to bankroll her arrogance. A week ago, that list would have made my blood rise. A month ago, it would have set off a bitter argument. Today, it brought me nothing but a deep-settled sense of amusement. I felt a small laugh climbing in my chest, but I forced it back down. I reached out slowly and took the paper from her outstretched fingers. What comes next is the moment everything Gerald has quietly set in motion finally begins to move, and the people who took him for granted are about to feel the full weight of that. Before we get there, I want to ask you if someone in your own family had been treating you like a problem to be managed. Would you let them know you saw it, or would you handle it entirely on your own terms? I did not open it to read the new additions. I had no interest in knowing what fresh extravagances she had stacked onto my supposed tab. I simply nodded, holding my face completely blank, concealing the deep satisfaction simmering just beneath the surface. I understand, Serena. I said, my voice smooth and entirely agreeable. You are under an enormous amount of pressure with your family arriving so soon. I will handle the shopping today. You don't need to give a single item on that list another thought. She released a long, theatrical exhale, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling, as though my cooperation was the absolute least she could expect. Well, make sure you check the expiration dates on the dairy, she ordered, turning her back to me immediately. The last time you bought cream for my coffee, it expired in 3 days. My mother scrutinizes everything. I cannot have her complaining about the quality of the food. And don't forget to ask the butcher to double wrap the prime rib. I don't want blood soaking through onto the refrigerator shelves, but stride away and snap another sharp command at Nolan, who was by now attempting to untangle an enormous knot of outdoor holiday lights. I looked down at the heavy paper in my hand. I ran my thumb along the crisp edge, feeling the premium stock she had used to print her list of demands. I folded it cleanly in half, then in half again, until it formed a small, tight square. I slid it into the front pocket of my trousers, stood up from my chair, and brushed an invisible speck of dust from my knee. I walked calmly to the hallway closet and pulled out my heavy winter coat. I worked my arms into the sleeves and buttoned it against the cold. I lifted my car keys from the small wooden bowl on the entryway table. From the living room, Serena heard the jingle of the keys and called out, reminding me not to forget extra bags of ice. I did not answer her. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing Indiana air. The cold wind struck my face, but I felt remarkably warm inside. I moved down the driveway to my reliable sedan. I was not headed to the upscale grocery store downtown. I was not going to purchase smoked salmon or artisanal gin. I was going to the bank to withdraw travel cash, and then I intended to enjoy a long, unhurried lunch at a quiet diner across town. I settled into the driver's seat, turned the engine over, and pushed the heater to full. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to savor every remaining second of it. I came back to the house later that afternoon, just as the winter sun dropped below the horizon and long gray shadows stretched across the frozen lawn. I had spent the previous hours over a quiet meal, putting the final touches on my travel arrangements. When I unlocked the front door, the house was still thrumming with the same frantic energy Serena had been generating all week. The smell of artificial pine air freshener hung thick and suffocating in the air. I did not announce my return. I climbed the stairs in silence, leaving them to their chaotic preparations below. In my study, I retrieved the final item I had kept set aside for exactly this moment. It was the sleek vintage leather suitcase I had purchased years ago for a trip Evelyn and I took to Europe. Sturdy, elegant, and perfectly suited for a winter retreat. I opened it and packed the last of my essential clothing, my shaving kit, and a few personal items. I pressed the heavy brass locks shut. The sharp metallic click rang through the empty room with a finality I found deeply satisfying. I pulled on my heavy wool winter coat, adjusted my scarf, and gripped the leather handle. I was ready. I walked out of the study and moved toward the main staircase. Below the foyer was a scene of domestic disorder. Serena stood near the entryway, gripping her clipboard, her pen hammering an impatient rhythm against the metal clip. Nolan was balanced halfway up a stepladder, clumsily trying to drape a thick garland of artificial greenery across the front door frame. They were bickering over the placement of the lights, entirely lost in their small, superficial world. I started down the wooden staircase. The solid thud of my leather shoes and the faint creak of the floorboards drew their attention at once. Nolan twisted to look over his shoulder, one hand gripping the ladder. Serena's pen went still. She turned her eyes traveling from my winter coat down to the heavy leather suitcase in my hand. For a brief moment, a look of pure bewilderment moved across her carefully composed face. Her mind simply could not reconcile what she was seeing with the reality she had built for herself. "Where are you going?" she demanded, her voice sharp and edged with irritation. "And where are the groceries you were supposed to go to the butcher hours ago? Why do you have a suitcase? Are you bringing up old blankets from the basement for the cousins?" I reached the bottom of the staircase and came to a stop on the marble floor of the foyer. I did not set the suitcase down. I kept my posture straight, meeting her eyes with complete calm. I let the silence hold for a few seconds, giving the full weight of the moment room to settle over the room. I looked at Nolan, his knuckles white against the sides of the ladder. Then I looked back at Serena. I let a genuine, unhurried smile spread across my face, the smile of a man who has just finished a long and demanding construction project and is walking off the site for the last time. "Your family is arriving in exactly 48 hours, I said, my voice even and measured. 30 people. I think that is absolutely wonderful. Perfect, actually." Serena's grip tightened on her clipboard. "What are you talking about? Where is the food? Gerald chose you and me." I firmed my hold on the leather handle. "I am going on vacation to Park City," I told her, letting each syllable settle clearly through the foyer. "You can cook and clean for your guests. I am not a servant." The reaction was immediate and deeply satisfying to observe. Every trace of color left Serena's face, leaving her complexion pale and slightly sickly. Her mouth parted, but nothing came out. The clipboard dipped in her loosening grip. She looked at me the way a person looks when they realize the language being spoken is one they do not know. Her reality was cracking open right in front of me. "Park City." She finally "What do you mean, Park City? What about the groceries? What about my parents needing the master suite?" "You agreed to move to the basement." I held my smile. "The master suite is entirely yours to manage, Serena. As for the grocery list, it is still folded in my pocket. I would strongly suggest you leave for the store right now if you want any chance of securing those premium cuts you were so specific about. The shelves clear out fast this time of year." Nolan nearly lost his footing on the ladder. He scrambled down and moved toward me, palms raised, his face flushed with alarm. "Dad, wait!" he pleaded. "You can't just leave us here. We have 30 people coming. We can't handle all this on our own. You have to stay. We need you." "You do not need me, Nolan," I replied, regarding my only son with cool, clinical detachment. "You need a maid and a caterer. I am neither of those things. I am a man heading out on a well-deserved ski trip." Before Nolan could piece together another desperate argument, a pair of bright headlights swept across the frosted glass of the front door. The crunch of heavy tires moving over the gravel announced the arrival of my transportation. I had arranged for a private black town car to take me directly to the airport, and the driver was perfectly on time. I turned away from my son and his wife. I reached for the brass handle of the front door and pulled it open, letting a rush of freezing winter air flood the warm foyer. Outside, the sleek black car idled in the driveway, pale exhaust curling up into the cold evening sky. The driver had already stepped out and was holding the rear door open, waiting. I did not look back. I offered no parting speech, no bitter final word. I simply crossed the threshold, drawing my leather suitcase behind me. The heavy wooden door shut with a solid, resonant thud, leaving Nolan and Serena standing frozen in the foyer, surrounded by half-hung holiday decorations and the terrifying reality of their own incompetence. I settled into the warm leather seat of the town car, told the driver to head to the airport, and watched the house recede into the distance, feeling nothing but the vast, glorious quiet of freedom. The heated leather seats held a comforting warmth as the vehicle glided down the icy highway. I sat in the hushed luxury of the back seat, watching bare trees blur past the tinted windows. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone, not to check holiday messages or scan the news. I opened the banking application. I knew precisely what was unfolding back in my former zip code. The trap I had so carefully constructed was just about ready to spring. Serena had been boxed into a corner entirely of her own making. With 30 demanding relatives due in under 48 hours and the pantry completely bare, she had no options left. She could not wait on Nolan. She had to brave the cold and push through the doors of the luxury supermarket downtown to work through her enormous grocery list. I could see it perfectly. She would have blown through the automatic sliding doors, commandeering 3 separate carts, and snapping at a teenage employee to help her manage them. She would have carved through the crowded aisles, loading the carts with oversized prime rib roasts, imported French brie, 6 bottles of a specific aged single malt scotch, a brand I knew retailed for over $180 a bottle, and the artisanal gin her uncle required. She would have moved through the store like royalty, tossing items in without a glance at the price tags, entirely secure in her false belief that my bank account was absorbing every dollar. I settled deeper into my seat, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. At exactly 6:45 in the evening, the first notification landed. A bright red alert from the credit card company. An attempted charge of $250 at the downtown premium grocer, and right below the total, the word I had been waiting for. Declined. A soft, genuine laugh escaped me and filled the quiet cabin. The sequence of events playing out at that checkout lane was entirely predictable. The teenage cashier would have worked through the mountain of luxury groceries, bagging them steadily, while the total climbed on the digital display. Serena would have been standing there, examining her nails or scrolling her phone completely unbothered. When the final sum was announced, she would have slid the supplementary card I had issued her months ago across the counter without a second thought. The cashier would have run it through the terminal. The machine would have issued a hard, flat rejection. I knew Serena. I knew her pride. When the cashier calmly told her the card had been declined, she would not have apologized. She would have scoffed. She would have told the cashier with total confidence that the machine was clearly malfunctioning and insisted they try again. My phone buzzed a second time. Another notification appeared. The identical amount, the identical result. Declined. I could picture the panic seizing her chest. The line of well-dressed, impatient holiday shoppers stretching behind her would be shifting and murmuring. People checking their watches. The polished, flawless image she had fought so hard to project was fracturing it. The cashier would have returned the useless card and asked for another form of payment. She could not abandon 3 carts piled with custom-cut meats and rare imported cheeses. Walking away empty-handed in front of that crowd would have been a fate worse than death for a woman like her. She had no other move. She would have been forced to open her own designer wallet and pull out her personal credit cards, the ones she kept carefully out of sight. The cards running 24% interest and carrying massive rolling balances. She would have had to swipe her own plastic, absorbing the full financial blow right there at the register. 30 minutes later, my town car pulled up to the terminal. I paid the driver, checked my luggage, and made my way to the airline lounge. I ordered a glass of sparkling water, found a quiet corner, and set my phone on the table. It immediately began to vibrate without stopping. Nolan's name kept appearing on the screen, call after call. I did not answer. I watched the missed calls accumulate until they rolled to voicemail. When the ringing finally stopped, I pressed play on the messages. The audio was distorted by the sheer volume of screaming in the background. It was Nolan. His voice was frantic, breathless, shaking with panic. "Dad, you need to call me back right now," he managed. "There's been a massive bank error. Serena just got back from the store and your card declined. She had to put almost $5,000 on her own credit card, and it completely maxed out her limit. You need to transfer the funds to us immediately. Call the bank. Fix this. We don't have the money to cover this." Beneath his voice in the background, I could make out Serena's unmistakable shrill pitch. She was completely hysterical. I could hear the crack of heavy grocery bags hitting the kitchen counters. She was screaming at Nolan, calling him useless, demanding to know why my accounts had been frozen right before her family arrived. She was unraveling in spectacular fashion, tearing their fragile arrangement apart over a few $1,000s worth of premium cheese and raw meat. I deleted the voicemail with a single tap. I did not call the bank. I did not move a single penny. I simply powered down my phone, tucked it into my jacket pocket, and watched the snow begin to fall across the runway beyond the lounge window. The first structural pillar of their counterfeit kingdom had collapsed entirely, burying them under its weight. And the most satisfying part of the whole operation was the knowledge that the real catastrophe had not yet arrived. The utility shutoff was still 3 days away. I took a slow, easy sip of my water. The holiday season was shaping up to be absolutely spectacular. I had been gone exactly 48 hours. In the mind of a structural engineer, 48 hours is a significant unit of measurement. It is precisely the window required for an unmaintained operating system to display its first visible signs of critical stress. For 3 years, I had been the invisible current, keeping that large property functioning. I swept the extensive hardwood floors. I polished the granite countertops. I dragged the heavy trash bins out before they overflowed. I kept the temperature perfectly regulated throughout. Without my daily interventions, the house was a rapidly deteriorating ecosystem. Nolan and Serena had neither the discipline nor the inclination to maintain a property of that scale. I knew the large porcelain sink was already heaped with dirty dishes from their panicked improvised meals. I knew the garbage bags were swelling and seeping in the kitchen because neither of them had the foresight to haul the bins down the long, icy driveway before the storm rolled in. The invasion began precisely at 3:40 in the afternoon. I knew this because my security camera application, which I had conveniently left running on my mobile device while sitting comfortably in my Park City lodge, triggered a motion alert at the front door. I watched the silent footage from thousands of miles away, a warm cup of coffee in hand. A large fleet of rental cars and hulking suburban transport swarmed the driveway, parking at careless angles on the frozen grass and blocking the sidewalk entirely. The doors flew open and the horde descended. 30 people spilled out into the freezing Indiana air, dragging oversized rolling suitcases, complaining loudly about the cold and shouting over one another. A turbulent mass of heavy winter coats and deeply entitled attitudes. I watched them bottleneck at the front porch. Serena pulled the door open wide, her face stretched into a frantic, straining smile. She had on a thin luxury sweater, doing her best to project the image of a composed, prosperous hostess, welcoming her guests to a grand estate. But reality bore down on her immediately. 30 people trampling through the foyer meant 60 wet, muddy winter boots dragging melting snow and road salt directly across the pristine marble tiles I used to mop by hand. The entryway became a filthy, overcrowded disaster in minutes. The sheer volume of bodies had overwhelmed the delicate atmosphere Serena had spent days trying to construct. She had devoted her entire adult life chasing her mother's approval, a woman whose native tongue was criticism dressed up as concern. I could picture the matriarch perfectly stepping into the foyer, peeling off her expensive leather gloves, and immediately cataloging every architectural shortcoming. Serena had hired a professional cleaning crew days earlier, but 48 hours of living in pure panic alongside Nolan had wiped that work clean off. Perfectly manicured fingertip along the ornate oak wainscoting in the hallway, lifting it to inspect the thin film of dust already collecting there. No yelling, no screaming. Just a soft, quietly devastated sigh, the kind that cut straight through her daughter's brittle sense of self. The guest rooms were the next structural weak point. Without me, there to launder the heavy winter bedding, fold the guest towels, and dress the pillows properly. The accommodations fell well short of acceptable. Serena had undoubtedly herded her relatives into spare rooms and converted office spaces, apologizing in that frantic, over-explaining way she had, and almost certainly inventing a fictional household staff who had taken the holiday off. I listened later that night to the string of frantic voicemails Nolan had left me, describing the disaster unfolding inside those walls. He was whispering from behind a locked bathroom door, begging me to come back. Serena, he said, was teetering on the edge of a complete breakdown. Her aunt was loudly declaring that the cheap air mattresses were deflating against the cold hardwood floors, leaving her to sleep on rigid bare wood. Her younger cousins were scrapping over the single shared bathroom in the east wing because the hot water tank had absolutely no hope of keeping up with a dozen people showering back to back. The house simply wasn't designed or plumbed to function as a high-capacity hotel, and the infrastructure was buckling under the sudden crushing load. But the most spectacular failure of the evening played out in the formal dining room. Serena had maxed out her credit limits at the luxury supermarket downtown, focusing nearly all of it on premium cuts and artisanal cheeses. She had completely misjudged the sheer quantity of alcohol needed to keep 30 highly critical relatives placated across a long winter night. Her father, an arrogant, self-important man who fancied himself an amateur sommelier, had made his way to the built-in mahogany bar expecting to find a thoughtfully curated spread of premium spirits. What he found instead were a handful of cheap bottles of generic table wine that Serena had grabbed in desperation from a corner convenience store once her funds had run dry. Nolan was sobbing into his voicemail as he described the scene in excruciating detail. He told me how his father-in-law held up a bottle of $15 blended red, turning the cheap metal screw cap over in his hand with naked contempt. The man swung toward the room and asked loudly whether the logistics firm Nolan worked for was heading toward bankruptcy because pouring this kind of offensive swill for family was simply an embarrassment. He demanded to know why they were occupying such a massive, expensive house if they couldn't even manage to stock a basic liquor cabinet for the holidays. He stripped away his daughter's glossy veneer of wealth right there in front of everyone, exposing the hollow performance underneath. I sat beside the roaring fireplace in my ski lodge in Park City, watching heavy snow settle over the dark Wasatch Mountains, listening to Nolan hyperventilate on the recording. The house in Indiana was loud, overcrowded, and trending rapidly toward unsanitary. The guests were hungry, exhausted, and merciless in their judgment of everything around them. Serena was locking herself inside the kitchen pantry to cry in private while Nolan hid in the guest bathroom, leaving desperate messages on the phone of the very man they had tried to exile to a freezing, unfinished basement. The grand fiction of their prosperity was fracturing under the relentless, unsparing scrutiny of the exact people they had been trying to impress. The structural integrity of their marriage was deteriorating fast, and the internal pressure was only going to climb as the hours passed. 30 ungrateful, demanding guests were pressing down on a foundation built entirely from lies and stolen credit. They were crumbling, and there was no one to blame for it but themselves. And the most magnificent part of the whole situation was knowing that the true catastrophic failure, the absolute freezing termination of their false reality, hadn't even arrived yet. The winter storm was only just beginning. The morning of December 23rd descended on the Indiana Valley with absolute brutality. I watched the national weather broadcast from the comfort of my luxury suite in Park City, nursing a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. A massive winter system had stalled directly over the Midwest. Heavy, blinding snow was falling at 2 inches an hour, and the ambient temperature had plunged into the single digits. The wind chill was severe enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. It was the kind of hostile, unforgiving weather that makes a structurally sound, fully heated home feel like an impregnable fortress against nature. But my former home was no longer a fortress. As of 8 o'clock that morning, it was simply a large brick box bleeding out its thermal mass. I knew the precise moment the trap would spring. I had engineered the utility account transfer with the accuracy of a digital timer. When the clock struck the hour, the automated systems at the regional electric and gas companies processed the finalized legal transfer. My name was scrubbed from the ledger entirely. The new account holder was registered as a commercial demolition and development firm. Under standard corporate safety protocols, any structure scheduled for imminent teardown must have all volatile utilities severed completely to prevent accidental fires or explosions. No technician needed to show up at the property and throw a physical switch. Smart grid. Deep inside the walls of the house, the lifeblood of the property simply stopped moving. The massive forced air heating units in the basement powered down and went completely still. The glowing digital thermostats in the hallways went dark. The pilot lights on both water heaters were extinguished. The current pulsing through the copper wiring faded, leaving every outlet and overhead fixture stone dead. The heavy refrigerator packed with Serena's thousands of dollars worth of premium meats and artisanal cheeses stopped humming. The house didn't simply lose power, it died, completely. I could picture the sequence with perfect clarity. The 30 demanding, self-satisfied guests would have been sleeping, taking full advantage of the holiday rest. But a house that size sheds heat with startling speed when the outside air sits in the single digits. The cold would have pushed through the large bay windows, sliding across the hardwood floors and creeping up the stairwells. The air in the bedrooms would have turned sharp and biting. One by one, the relatives would have stirred, pulling thin decorative blankets up around their chins. Someone, almost certainly the pompous father-in-law, would have shuffled out of the master suite, expecting a hot shower and a fresh cup of quality coffee. He'd have twisted the brass handle and found nothing but ice-cold water blasting from the shower head. He'd have moved to the kitchen, snapping light switches in the hallway and finding only thick, pressing darkness. The entire household would have spilled out of their rooms, bundled in winter coats over pajamas, demanding explanations, complaining at full volume about the freezing temperatures and the absence of basic amenities. Nolan would have been the first target of their collective fury. Serena would have been shrieking at him to fix it immediately, She needed to dry her hair, and her relatives were starving. She'd have assumed it was a blown fuse or a localized neighborhood outage. She'd have ordered him down to the basement to reset the system. I knew exactly what Nolan felt as he descended those wooden stairs into the dark, freezing concrete below. He'd have used the faint flashlight on his cell phone to navigate the space. He'd have crossed toward the main electrical panel, brushing past the empty walls where my tools once hung. He'd have pulled open the metal door of the breaker box and swept his light across the rows of black plastic switches. He'd have expected to find one flipped the wrong way, but every single switch would have been perfectly aligned. He'd have toggled the main breaker off and back, on straining to hear the familiar, reassuring hum of the furnace coming to life. But the basement would have stayed absolutely silent. The silence of a disconnected grid is its own particular weight. It is heavy and dead, and it offers nothing in the way of answers. Standing in the freezing dark, Nolan would have understood this was not a blown fuse. He'd have pulled his phone from his pocket and watched the battery percentage tick slowly downward in the cold. He would have dialed the emergency customer service line for the regional electric company. He would have worked through the maddening automated menus, jabbing buttons with shaking fingers, desperate to reach a human voice. He needed someone to send a technician out immediately, anything to shield him from the fury of 30 freezing, furious in-laws waiting one floor above. I learned the precise details of that phone call later that evening through a frantic tear-soaked voicemail Nolan left on my blocked number. He had finally gotten through to a representative and aggressively demanded to know why his house had been cut off in the middle of a blizzard. He gave them the address and ordered them to restore service at once. The representative, composed professional, would have pulled the account up on her screen. She would have asked for his name, then politely advised him that he was not listed as an authorized contact for that address and could not make any changes or inquiries. Nolan described in his tearful message how he had shouted at the woman, insisting he was the homeowner's son and that they needed emergency heat. The representative would have held her corporate composure without flinching. She would have explained that the previous owner, Gerald, had closed the account successfully several days prior. She would have made clear that the property now sat on the books under a commercial holding company, and then she would have delivered the final, reality-shattering blow. She would have told him that the new corporate owner had explicitly requested a complete, hard termination of all utility services at that address. She would have stated plainly that the property was legally coded as a condemned structure awaiting immediate commercial demolition, and that accordingly, no utilities could or would be restored there under any circumstances. She would have advised him to vacate the premises for his own safety. I sat in Park City watching snow drift down over the brilliant white peaks, my coffee warm in my hand. I could imagine the sheer terror locking around Nolan's chest as he stood alone in that dark, freezing basement. Demolition. Corporate owner. Condemned structure. The words would have wheeled through his mind like carrion birds. The full weight of the situation would have dropped on him all at once, forcing the air from his lungs. The enormous, expensive house he had been treating as his own personal free hotel, gone, sold out from beneath him while he was sleeping. He had no legal standing. He had no power. He had no heat. He was a broke, unemployed man in a freezing basement holding a maxed-out credit card with an enraged and entitled wife and 30 demanding relatives upstairs waiting for him to solve a problem. That elaborate illusion he and Serena had constructed so carefully to impress their family was not merely cracking. It had dissolved entirely. The temperature in the house was falling by the minute, but the real cold, the inescapable bone-deep dread of complete ruin, had finally reached him. The heavy timber beams of the Park City ski lodge arched high overhead, framing a vast wall of flawless glass. Beyond the window, thick white flakes drifted down from a bright silver sky, settling gently across the jagged ridgelines of the Wasatch Mountains. Inside the private lounge, the atmosphere was a study in pure luxury and untroubled comfort. A colossal stone fireplace commanded the far wall, stacked with thick cedar logs that crackled and popped, throwing a deep, steady warmth across the room. I was settled into a plush, oversized leather armchair, my feet angled toward the hearth. In my right hand sat a heavy crystal glass holding a premium-aged spirit, the amber liquid catching and holding the firelight. Soft instrumental jazz drifted from unseen speakers, weaving through the low murmur of other well-heeled guests enjoying their winter escape. I was entirely at ease. My heart rate was slow and even. I was a man who had steered through a dangerous passage and arrived finally at a safe and distant harbor. My phone rested on the polished wooden table beside my chair. For the past hour, the screen had been completely dark and still. I knew Nolan was likely frozen in place down in that basement, trying to absorb the catastrophic truth the utility company had just dropped on him. He lacked the nerve to come at me directly, not after hearing the words condemned and demolition. But Serena was a different matter entirely. Her whole identity was currently disintegrating in front of the precise audience she had spent years performing for. Her desperation would burn right through any impulse toward caution. Right on schedule, the dark screen of my phone blazed to life. The device rattled against the polished wood, skidding slightly across the surface. I glanced down at the caller ID, Serena. I didn't answer immediately. I let it vibrate, watching her name pulse across the screen again and again. I took a slow, unhurried sip from the crystal glass, letting the rich warmth spread down my throat. I savored the total control I held in that moment. I was the architect with the only set of blueprints for a building that was presently collapsing around her. On the fifth ring, I reached over, picked up the phone, and pressed the green button. I brought it to my ear and said nothing. I simply let the silence sit, waiting for her to speak first. "Gerald!" She screamed. It completely unraveled her voice, a high, jagged pitch. The volume forced me to pull the phone a few inches from my ear. "It is freezing in here. The power is completely out, and the water is like ice. My mother is sitting in the living room, wearing 3 winter coats, and my uncle is threatening to book a flight back home. Nolan went down to the basement, and he is speaking absolute nonsense about the house being scheduled for demolition. You need to call the utility company right now and fix this massive bank error. Give them your credit card number and tell them to turn the heat back on immediately. You are ruining my entire Christmas. You are humiliating me in front of my family." I leaned back in my leather chair, listening to the symphony of ruin playing out behind her voice. The sound of chattering teeth, shivering bodies. A woman who sounded unmistakably like her arrogant mother, announcing loudly that she could see her own breath in the dining room. Sharp, furious voices, demanding answers, hot coffee, a warm place to sleep. The whole atmosphere was a toxic, freezing pressure cooker of resentment and blame. And Serena was pinned right in the middle of it, utterly powerless to stop the collapse of the image she had worked so hard to build. I listened to her breathing in ragged, shallow bursts into the receiver. She was hyperventilating, gasping, her reality coming apart into pieces too small to reassemble. She was waiting for an apology. She was waiting for me to tell her I was already on the line with the power company sorting it out. She was waiting for the compliant old man to step forward and bankroll her rescue one final time. I swirled the amber liquid gently, watching the firelight move through the crystal. "Serena," I said, my voice dropping to a low, smooth, unhurried register. The measured quiet of my tone stood in direct contrast to her frantic screaming. "There is no bank error, there is no billing mistake, and there is absolutely nothing I can do to restore the heat to that property." "What are you talking about?" she demanded it, her voice fracturing with rising terror. "It is your house. You pay the bills, call them, and fix it." "That is where you are fundamentally incorrect," I replied, drawing each word out with the patient cadence of a teacher walking a slow student through a very basic concept. "I do not pay the bills and more, to the point I do not own that house any longer. I sold the entire property to a commercial real estate developer in a straight cash transaction. The final paperwork was signed weeks ago." The line went completely silent. For a few glorious seconds, there was nothing but the snap and crackle of the cedar logs in my fireplace, and the faint, distant howl of the Indiana blizzard bleeding through her end of the call. I could almost hear the machinery inside her mind locking up and shattering as the truth finally broke through her wall of denial. "You sold it!" she whispered, her voice barely rising above the noise of her. "But we live here. My family is here. Where are we supposed to go?" "And that is a logistical problem you will need to work out on your own." I told her, a deep and profound satisfaction settling over me like warmth from a fire. "The developer assumed full legal control of the utilities this morning. Standard corporate demolition protocol demands a hard shutoff of all volatile services to eliminate liability before the bulldozers arrive on the 26th. I have absolutely zero legal authority over that address. I cannot call anyone to restore the heat. You are currently trespassing inside a condemned commercial structure. It binded by Bispextal." "Gerald, please!" She whimpered, every trace of arrogance and entitlement gone from her voice, replaced by raw, naked desperation. Please, you cannot do this to us. It is freezing. We have no money to go anywhere else. My parents will never forgive me. Please help us. I gazed out through the broad glass windows, watching the snow lay itself gently across the quiet Park City slopes. I thought about the 3 years I had spent on my knees scrubbing wine stains from antique rugs. I thought about the thousands of dollars she had drained from my accounts on designer purchases. I thought about the night she told me to sleep on a broken metal spring in a damp basement, so her parents could have the bed I had once shared with my late wife. You demanded the house for the holidays, Serena. I said, my voice settling into a whisper of complete finality. I gave it to you. Try not to freeze. I pulled the phone from my ear, cutting off the frantic, pathetic sobs that were just beginning to pour out of her. I pressed the red button and ended the call, severing the connection for good. The screen went dark. I opened my device settings and went directly to the contact management menu. I found Serena and tapped the option to block her number. I scrolled to Nolan and did the same. I locked the phone and set it face down on the polished wooden table beside me. The silence that followed was not an empty one. It was full and rich and deeply satisfying, the sound of a perfectly engineered structural collapse, executing precisely according to plan. I eased my head back against the soft leather of the chair and lifted my crystal glass toward the roaring fire in a silent toast to Evelyn. The winter storm bearing down on Indiana was going to be brutal tonight. Inside my lodge, the temperature was absolutely perfect. Christmas Eve morning broke with brilliant, blinding sunlight, bouncing off thick layers of fresh snow. In Park City, I woke feeling completely refreshed and well-rested. I ordered a generous room service breakfast and poured myself a hot cup of dark coffee. I crossed to the suite's wide windows and settled into the small glass table there. I opened my tablet and pulled up the security application. I had been careful to leave the high-definition exterior and entryway cameras fully active, connected to a dedicated cellular backup line. I wanted to watch the final structural collapse with complete clarity. The digital feed from Indiana loaded on the screen. The entire neighborhood sat buried under 2 feet of snow. My former driveway had become a chaotic frozen parking lot, jammed with the rental vehicles of 30 furious, shivering relatives. The windows of the brick house were frosted entirely over from the inside, a telling sign that the interior temperature was hovering dangerously near freezing. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen advance. It was exactly 9:00 in the morning. Right on schedule, a heavy white commercial utility truck, fitted with a snowplow, rolled onto the street. A sleek black corporate vehicle followed close behind. They moved slowly past the snow-hemmed rental cars and came to a stop at the base of the driveway. The doors of the black vehicle swung open first. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the freezing air. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, a precisely tailored suit, and carried a thick metal clipboard. This was the commercial property manager representing the luxury development firm. He moved with the rigid, unyielding authority of a man accustomed to million-dollar contracts and unforgiving corporate deadlines. He was not alone. From the white utility truck, 3 more men climbed out. 2 of them were large, imposing private security contractors in thick black tactical jackets and heavy boots. They had the bearing of professional enforcers there to guarantee compliance. The 3rd man carried a heavy leather tool belt slung over one shoulder, a commercial locksmith brought in to drill the existing locks and secure the perimeter of the condemned structure. The 4 men marched up the icy front walkway in a tight, coordinated formation. They did not look like holiday visitors. They looked like an eviction detail. I turned up the volume on the tablet, listening through the crisp audio feed of the porch camera. The property manager stepped up to the heavy front door. He didn't bother searching for the bell. He raised his gloved hand and landed 4 sharp, aggressive knocks against the solid wood. The sound cracked through the freezing morning air, heavy and demanding, carrying the full weight of legal authority. For a full minute, nothing stirred. The property manager checked his clipboard, confirmed the address, and knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door inched open a few inches. Serena appeared in the gap, and the sight of her was absolutely glorious. The immaculately groomed, imperious woman who had demanded premium spirits and imported cheeses was entirely gone. In her place stood a shivering, hollowed-out figure, wrapped tightly in a thick, ugly sleeping bag, wearing dirty sweatpants and 3 layers of mismatched sweaters. Her hair was a tangled, greasy wreck. Her face had gone pale, her lips carrying a faint bluish tinge from a full night trapped inside a freezing house. She looked precisely like what she had become, a desperate squatter. She asked if she could help them, her voice trembling uncontrollably in the cold. The property manager regarded her with an expression of complete corporate detachment. He offered no warm holiday greeting. He glanced at the documents on his metal clipboard, then brought his eyes back to Serena. He announced, his voice carrying cleanly through the microphone, that he was the regional director for the commercial development group. He was there to conduct the final pre-demolition walkthrough with the previous owner. Serena gripped the edge of the door knuckles, going white. She stammered, teeth audibly chattering, that the previous owner wasn't there, that he had gone on vacation, and that they were his family staying for the Christmas holiday. The property manager's expression hardened. He stepped closer to the threshold. The two security contractors moved up directly behind him, arms folded across their broad chests, looming over Serena and casting a dark, heavy shadow across the entryway. The manager's tone dropped into something flat and unyielding. He said that what she was describing was not possible. He explained the property had been officially sold and legally transferred to a corporate holding company. The previous owner had surrendered all rights to the address, and the utility accounts had been terminated under standard safety protocols. The structure was officially classified as a condemned commercial site, slated for total demolition in exactly 48 hours. He raised his clipboard and pointed a gloved finger at the bold text printed across the top page. He stated that a demolition crew was arriving on the 26th, and that the property had been reported as fully vacant. Yet here he was, looking at a driveway packed with vehicles and a house full of unauthorized individuals. Serena opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her eyes moved from the unyielding property manager to the security guards, and finally to the locksmith, who was already running his hands over the brass hardware on the front door frame. The absolute finality of the moment was squeezing the air out of her. The manager stepped forward again, pressing Serena back slightly into the freezing foyer, and demanded to know precisely who she was and why 30 unauthorized individuals were currently occupying a condemned commercial building with no power, no running water, and no legal right to be on the premises. The word squatters rang out through the audio feed with a beautiful poetic resonance. She was no longer a wealthy hostess. She was no longer the queen of her suburban domain. A man with a clipboard had just reduced her to an unnamed faceless trespasser. Serena cried out, her voice fracturing under the weight of it, insisting they were not squatters. She said this was her father-in-law's house and that they lived there. She pleaded that her whole family was inside, that they were freezing. The property manager did not yield a single inch. He simply shook his head and drew a thick packet of legal documents from beneath the clip of his board. He said coldly, holding the papers up for her to see, that her father-in-law did not own the house. His corporation owned the house. She had no lease, no legal rights, and she was trespassing on a highly dangerous commercial construction site. I leaned back in my plush armchair in Park City and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. The first domino had been nudged, and the entire false reality she had constructed for her critical, judging relatives was about to collapse publicly in the middle of her freezing living room. The final eviction had officially begun. A freezing gust pushed through the open front door, carrying a fine mist of snow into the marble foyer. I leaned closer to the glowing tablet screen, watching the high-definition security feed with absolute fascination. Serena was shaking uncontrollably inside her dirty sleeping bag, staring at the property manager as though he were an executioner. The brutal truth of her situation was finally bearing down on her, but the real public destruction of her pride hadn't even started yet. From somewhere deep inside the freezing house, heavy footsteps rang down the hallway. Serena shrank back as her father came striding into the entryway. He was a large, pompous man who had spent the entire previous evening holding court with his siblings and cousins, loudly boasting about the enormous estate his successful daughter had acquired. He had a heavy wool coat pulled over his pajamas, his face flushed with cold and deep irritation. He positioned himself behind Serena, dropped a heavy hand onto her shoulder, and fixed a hard glare on the men standing at the door. He demanded to know what was happening and why the front door was thrown wide open, letting the cold pour in. He puffed his chest out, looked the property manager dead in the eye, and loudly declared that this was his daughter and son-in-law's private residence. He threatened to call the police if the men didn't clear off their property immediately. I lifted my coffee and took another slow, deeply satisfying sip in Park City, walked straight into the trap. The property manager did not flinch. He did not yield. He simply studied the older man with an expression of cool corporate detachment. He stated it very clearly, loudly enough that his voice traveled down the hallway and into the packed living room, that this was absolutely not her home. This property belonged to a commercial development firm, and every person currently inside was trespassing. The father let out a loud, dismissive laugh, waving his hand as though swatting away an insect. He insisted there had to be some clerical mix-up, because his daughter Serena and her husband Nolan had recently acquired this large suburban estate. He turned to Serena, fully expecting her to back him up and send the men off the porch. But Serena could not speak. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her face half buried in the folds of her sleeping bag, shivering from something that had nothing to do with the temperature. At that moment, Nolan appeared at the top of the basement stairs, dragging himself across the floor like a man walking his last steps to the gallows. He was completely hollowed out, shoulders collapsed, face a blank mask of total defeat. He crossed the foyer and stepped up beside his humiliated wife and his bewildered father-in-law. The property manager looked down at his clipboard, confirmed a name, then raised his eyes directly to my son. He asked if he was Nolan. Nolan nodded weakly, barely managing a whisper. The manager reached beneath his arm and drew out a heavy stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper and fastened with a thick blue clip. He didn't offer them politely. He drove the stack squarely into Nolan's chest, forcing him to grab hold of them. The manager announced loudly that he was officially serving them with a 24-hour notice of eviction. He stated that the attached documents included the final deed of sale, signed and executed by the lawful owner, Gerald. He made clear that the property had been sold in a cash transaction weeks prior, and that Nolan and Serena held no lease, no ownership claim, and no legal right to occupy the premises whatsoever. The silence in the foyer was total. The pompous father stared at the legal documents resting in Nolan's trembling hands. The color began draining steadily from the older man's face. He turned to his daughter, the arrogant edge gone from his voice, entirely replaced by a rising, unsteady panic. He asked Serena what this man was talking about. He demanded to know whether they actually owned the house. Behind them, the remaining 28 relatives had quietly gathered in the hallway and spilled into the living room, drawn by the commotion at the front door. All of them were bundled in coats and blankets, shivering in the unheated house, absorbing every single word. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent the past 2 days being ordered around by Serena were now watching her entire fabricated empire crumble in front of them. Nolan looked down at the documents, his eyes moving over the first page. He found my signature. He found the sale price. He found the transfer dates. He closed his eyes and released a broken, pathetic sob. He told the room that they didn't own the house. He admitted it was my house and that I had sold it out from under them without a single word of warning. The reaction from the assembled family was immediate and merciless. The whispers exploded into a loud, chaotic wave of shock and fury. An aunt near the back of the room shouted that they had traveled across the country to stay in a stolen house. An uncle declared bitterly that they were freezing to death inside a condemned building because Serena wanted to play pretend. The illusion of wealth and success had been shattered completely, leaving nothing behind but the bleak reality of 2 broke, entitled adults who had driven away the only person who had ever genuinely sustained them. Serena buried her face in her hands, sobbing in heavy, convulsing waves into the fabric of her sleeping bag. Her father took a large step back from her and regarded his daughter with a look of undisguised disgust mixed with profound embarrassment. He had spent months telling his golf partners and business associates about the magnificent estate his accomplished daughter owned. He understood in that precise moment that he had been bragging about a lie. His daughter was nothing more than a parasite who had spent years living off the generosity of an old man she had treated like something disposable. The property manager stood on the porch entirely unmoved by the family catastrophe playing out in front of him. He leveled a gloved finger at Nolan and delivered his final instruction. They had exactly 24 hours to gather their belongings and vacate the property. If the house was not fully cleared by 9 Ausrichterers, the following morning he would return with local police to begin processing arrests for criminal trespass. He turned, descended the icy front walk, and the locksmith and both security contractors fell in behind him. They got back into their vehicles and pulled away, leaving the front door hanging wide open. The winter wind howled into the foyer, sweeping across the polished marble floor. Nolan and Serena stood frozen in the entryway, completely exposed and entirely defenseless beneath the furious, judgmental stares of their 30 freezing relatives. From my warm, comfortable sanctuary, I'll unfold with a deep and complete sense of satisfaction. The structural collapse was total. There was nothing left of their false kingdom but rubble. The heavy front door gaped open, letting the Indiana blizzard drive straight into the grand foyer. The property manager had delivered his 24-hour ultimatum and departed, leaving behind a complete vacuum of authority. That vacuum was instantly filled by the furious, indignant rage of Serena's humiliated family. I leaned forward in my leather chair in Park City, watching the security feed with rapt attention. The paralytic shock that had gripped the 30 relatives dissolved in an instant, replaced by a frantic, desperate urgency to escape the condemned building. Serena's father was the first to shatter the silence. He turned his back on his daughter, ignoring her sobbing entirely. He announced loudly to the whole gathering that they were leaving at once. He declared he would not spend another minute freezing inside a stolen house while his own daughter performed some sick, delusional charade. His voice rang up the grand staircase like a starting pistol, firing the mass exodus. The retreat began. Aunts, uncles, and cousins scrambled back up the stairs toward the guest rooms to collect their things. Through the interior hallway cameras, I watched the chaos play out in full. The carefully staged holiday illusion was torn apart in minutes. Suitcases were wrenched open across unmade beds. Clothes and toiletries were crammed hastily into canvas bags. The cheap, deflated air mattresses were left where they lay on the hardwood floors. Nobody was thinking about neat packing. The only priority was getting out of the freezing dark house before things got any worse. Down in the foyer, Serena scrambled desperately from relative to relative, still wrapped in her dirty sleeping bag, begging them to wait. She cornered her cousins and tried to spin some ridiculous story about a bank error and a miscommunication with the real estate developer. Her family had no interest in hearing it. Her uncle shoved past her, hauling a heavy rolling suitcase, and told her flatly to get out of his way. Her cousins refused to acknowledge her at all, carrying their bags down the stairs without so much as a glance in her direction. The contempt they felt for her radiated through the silent video feed. Her father stood in the center of the living room, hammering furiously at his phone. The driveway was buried under snow and jammed solid with their frozen rental cars, making it impossible to drive out. He was coordinating a large-scale emergency evacuation through a premium rideshare app, booking a fleet of large SUVs to ferry the entire family to a luxury hotel downtown. He was using his own money to extract his relatives from the catastrophic disaster his daughter had engineered. Within 20 minutes, the first dark vehicles began pulling up along the snow-covered street. The family moved toward the front door, pulling their winter coats tight around their bodies, dragging luggage across the marble floor, and leaving long streaks of dirty, half-melted snow behind them. Not one of them said a word to Nolan. My son was slumped on the bottom step of the staircase, face buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by the wreckage closing in around him. He had shut down, entirely incapable of processing the full scope of what he had lost. As the final relatives filed through the front door, Serena made one last frantic attempt to salvage the relationship that mattered most to her. She reached out and caught her mother by the arm. The family matriarch, a woman whose entire world revolved around social standing and public image, stopped in the doorway. Serena sobbed openly, begging for money for a place to stay, for some measure of forgiveness. She asked her mother to cover a hotel room for her and Nolan, so they wouldn't be left out in the cold. The mother looked at her daughter with an expression of pure, undisguised disgust. There was no warm embrace, no word of comfort. She yanked her arm free with a sharp, decisive motion. Her voice was cold and precise, each word cutting cleanly through the freezing air. She told Serena that she was a profound embarrassment to the entire family. She said Serena had humiliated all of them in front of their extended relatives, luring them to a condemned, heatless house just to feed her own pathetic vanity. Then the mother delivered her final blow. She told Serena not to contact them for the remainder of the holiday season. She made it clear that Serena and Nolan had built this disaster entirely on their own, and they would have to dig themselves out of it without a single dollar of family money. She turned, stepped onto the snowy porch, and got into the waiting vehicle without once looking back. The SUVs pulled away from the curb, their red tail lights swallowed up by the thick white storm. The street fell into complete silence. The mass departure was finished. Inside the house, Nolan and Serena were entirely alone. They stood in the freezing dark foyer, surrounded by the muddy footprints of everyone who had just walked out on them and the shattered remnants of the life they had faked. Their bank accounts held nothing. Their credit cards were maxed to the limit. Their family had left in disgust, and they had exactly 23 hours to pack their lives into cardboard boxes before the police came to arrest them for criminal trespass. I reached over and tapped the tablet screen, closing the security application. The performance was over, and the ending had been absolutely flawless. I settled back into my armchair, feeling the deep, steady warmth of the fire spread across my face. I had designed a structural collapse of enormous scale, and it had executed with brilliant mathematical precision. I took a long, unhurried sip of my aged scotch and felt entirely at peace. A full week had gone by since the eviction. 7 uninterrupted days of complete quiet. I was seated on the private terrace of my Park City lodge and reading a novel I'd been neglecting for years. My phone rested on the small glass table beside my coffee. I had unblocked Nolan's number earlier that morning, not out of any readiness to forgive, but because a structural engineer always needs to confirm that the demolition went through completely. Right on schedule, the phone vibrated against the glass. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up and answering without saying a word. The audio coming through the speaker was wretched. I could make out the unmistakable background sounds of a cheap roadside motel, a police siren fading in the distance, a heavy commercial truck rumbling past, rattling the thin walls of wherever my son had ended up. Behind him, I could clearly hear Serena crying, not the theatrical, manipulative sobbing she deployed for audiences. This was the hollow, exhausted weeping of a woman who had run entirely out of road. By dismantling that physical structure and safeguarding our financial assets, I protected everything Evelyn and I had truly stood for. I protected our dignity. I protected our life's work from being methodically stripped away by 2 adults who flatly refused to respect the very hands that had sustained them. I eased back into my plush lounge chair, eyes closing, face tilted upward into the brilliant morning sun. The absolute silence of the penthouse is the most beautiful symphony I have encountered in all my years. It is a thick, dense, enveloping silence, undisturbed by selfish demands, untouched by petty manipulation, and wholly free of parental guilt. I spent my entire professional career engineering massive structures built to carry the crushing weight of the world. But today, sitting on this balcony, I bear no weight at all. My foundation is completely solid. And so, there I sat, warm sun on my face, the gulf stretched out before me, and not a single demand left on my shoulders. That is where this story ends. And honestly, that is exactly where it was always meant to end. I will not pretend it cost nothing to get here. Cutting ties with your own child is not something you do lightly, and there were nights in that cold Indiana house when the weight of it pressed down hard. But I believe God does not waste suffering. The losses, the humiliation, and the years of being quietly disrespected under my own roof, all of it served a purpose. It cleared the ground for something solid. Evelyn and I built a life worth protecting and protecting. It was the most honest thing I could have done in her memory. If these father stories mean anything to you, I hope they mean this: a parent's love is not a blank check. Generosity without boundaries is not kindness. It is an invitation to be taken advantage of. And when the people you love most refuse to see that sometimes the most powerful act of self-respect is the quiet one, the one they never see coming. Remember, your financial security is yours to guard. Do not hand the keys to someone who has never respected the house. Document everything and trust the slow work of patience over the quick relief of confrontation. And if this story of a dad's revenge resonates with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that it is never too late to reclaim what is yours. Leave a comment and tell me your thoughts. I read them and they matter to me. If you have not yet subscribed to His Hidden Revenge, now is a good time. There are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself.